Well, we've heard about quantum and AI for good, but obviously there are other issues. It is also for bad. Now we're going to hear about space, and I think in a way you have the same issues. All sorts of great things can come out of space and quantum, but it can also be a threat to us all. But we've got an amazing panel. We've got as chair Lord Willits, UK Space Agency. Lord Willits, where are you? Do please come up. Julie Hill-Jones from Space Foresight, Jay Lowell from Boeing, and Kata Escott from Airbus.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for inviting us along so that you get the space angle on this summit. We've got a fantastic panel. Perhaps before I turn to the panel, I could just very briefly explain how we in the Space Agency fit in. We're very proud of the fact that Britain has got a very lively space sector, 1,700 companies, many of them very small companies, many which have benefited from early stage grants from us in the Space Agency. And we've also got some fantastic primes like Airbus, a key player in our space sector, which is very active and very welcome and very positive here in the UK. Probably for us in the Space Agency, our frustration is the challenge of growing more companies, getting some of those really small companies to scale up so that as well as small companies and very large companies, we have more rapidly growing medium-sized companies. That's our challenge, and we don't have the budget to carry on funding them ourselves. We do have increasingly productive discussions with bodies such as the British Business Bank on how we can come together and between us promote more investment in those startups as they scale up. And the more that we can create a flourishing environment for scale-ups, the better. And so as we are here today in the heart of the City of London, my message from the Space Agency when I'm in the city is do consider investing in space. There are a lot of misapprehensions and misunderstandings, people who think that it's riskier than it is, people who don't see how pervasive space is, people who don't recognize how useful space is. It is part of our critical national infrastructure, and there's both a national interest in continuing to develop it and also a commercial interest for investors. And one of the most exciting things of space is, of course, at the frontiers where space interacts with other technologies. And we're going to talk now about how space interacts with AI and also with quantum. And I'm going to start by turning to Kata Escott from Airbus, who runs Airbus UK. And it'd be very interesting to get the Airbus view on how you see both quantum and AI shaping and reshaping what you do. So over to you. You've got your own microphone. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So you asked about AI and quantum in space. I think these are two, I don't need to say it to this audience, they're totally transformative technologies that are really going to change the way that we operate in space. The pace at which they transform that is really hard to predict, apart from it's going to be really fast. And so that is one of the challenges that we have in terms of harnessing the technology. I mean, when it comes to communications and sensing, in fact, the sorts of things I think we're going to see is, much enhanced accuracy, automation, and all of that drives pace. I think it's not just how it will affect the technologies that we use in space, but also how back on Earth we'll do mission design, mission planning, and designing our spacecraft as well, which I think, again, will be much better informed by what quantum and AI bring to the table. And then also, if you think about the vast amount of data that we're collecting from space, what we can do with that and how we interpret it and how we draw insights from it, I think that will also change dramatically. So, how we make decisions based on that, and then how we feed that back into our next set of missions, I think is really going to change. Now, the thing that links all of these, as I say, is pace. And so I think what that really means for how our industry engage with these important technologies and the sector more generally is agility, to state the obvious. But there's all sorts of challenges to building that into the system, and I'm sure we'll come on to that shortly, including how we partner space agency, government, primes, and smaller businesses. But how we get that agility into the system is going to be absolutely key to how we harness those technologies for space.
Thank you very much. Now let's now hear from Jay Lowell, who is the Senior Technology Fellow at Boeing, and I think particularly working on quantum and space for Boeing. So how do you see things?
So I'm responsible for Boeing's quantum technology development. So I kind of look at this from the other end of the viewpoint that Kata just espoused. We see the inevitable progression of quantum technologies to come together and develop global quantum networks connecting quantum sensors, quantum computers. And to do that, you cannot do that without space as a part of that system. You cannot connect these things across the globe. A global quantum network cannot exist without space segments to do the long distance connections point to point across the globe. And so we've been focused on how do we expose the risks inherent in developing that technology, and to that end we've just recently announced that we are launching a satellite in 2026 that will test out technologies needed to build that kind of quantum network in our own self-funded demonstration, showing that we are able to produce a system that will execute a mission in space, that it will be reliable enough, that we understand how the components will behave and age, all in the purpose of allowing us to see that far field future of how we build that network to connect all these systems together. We need to be doing that every bit as much as we need to be developing the individual quantum technologies that we're going to link together. And our view is we can't do either or, we have to be doing both. And no one was doing this in the network space, so we decided we were going to go do it ourselves.
Very good. Thank you. And now Julie Holt-Jones, you created Space Foresight to identify all these key technology trends. How do you see space, quantum, and AI shaping out?
Thank you. And previous to that, I was a consultant, lived and worked around the world. It's interesting to see how the developments and in other countries in like Far East, India, the Middle East. It's interesting, I think, to put it into perspective. So the space industry is growing by an estimated 9% a year. 60% of that growth is by new entrants. And 7% of that growth is launch. The rest of all that growth is down to space services. So it's all about the data, huge amounts of data. And when we think to the future, if we can harness space, quantum, and AI together, that's when I get really excited, because the industry is all about the data. We need to be able to process that. And there are risks and opportunities. Maybe those risks can be opportunities for some companies, but we need to be able to identify both. If we think about specific applications, for example, we have a problem with debris in space. A loss of access to space, I think, has been estimated in the region of £1 billion to the UK economy per day. So one of those, there are threats and there are hazards. There are threats from hostiles, there are hazards, natural hazards. Some of that debris has been put there by hostiles, but some of it's evolved. I won't go into the detail of it. However, if we had a loss of access to space of £1 billion per day, AI and quantum in the future could make mapping of that debris a much more efficient way and be able to maneuver our spacecraft much more efficiently in the future. So that's a huge benefit. And if we look at the applications for a different company, for example, insurance, it's very important if we know where that debris is. Also, if we look at defence, quantum sensors, being able to scan the seabeds identifying submarines, for example. The applications go on and on, but for me, it's the combination of quantum and AI where we really see the exciting developments.
Now, I think it is worth just delving into some of the applications of this that are most relevant for the financial services industry. And you will have observed walking up the staircase to the conference today that we've got an atomic clock on display. And timing, and accurate timing, is a key feature now of transactions in the city. Atomic clocks now fly on satellites, and there are fascinating implications of the arrival of quantum technologies in space for timing and the timing of transactions in the city, which I know, Jay, is something that you are thinking about. Do you just want to explain here in the heart of one of the world's financial centers just what the changes in the nature of timing through quantum could mean for fintech and financial services?
So one of the things that Airbus and our company both are investing in is portable atomic clocks. The ones you see in there is part of a system that would take up multiple laser tables, so multiple tables, dining room tables sized pieces of equipment. And both of our companies are trying to figure out how to miniaturize this and how to field them into relevant environments like space, like airplanes. And the reason is that this new generation of clocks is about 1,000 times more accurate in terms of its ability to maintain time and its ability to disseminate one tick of a clock versus the next tick. That 1,000-time improvement in accuracy, a good way to think about this is the accuracy of a GPS atomic clock really gives you a sense of where you are to within a few feet. So if you think that you take that few feet and divide that by 1,000, you get down to fractions of a millimeter. Sorry to change units, but fractions of a millimeter. Now, we still have lots of issues to deal with how the atmosphere affects these signals and the transmissions thereof, but the timing itself can make things like trading arbitrage much, much more precise, so that you have two ways that plays out. One is at the trading floor, you can better distinguish which trade arrives before the other. But if you have a distributed timing network, you have the ability to actually arbitrage the trade not by when it arrives at the floor, but by when it's made at its origin, and take that transit time out of the equation, which might be a more fair way to actually act on the information and to act on those trades. But it's all enabled by the accuracy of these clocks.
I'm just going to build on that, because you asked specifically about how it's going to affect the financial world, but of course there's huge defense applications and benefits for that as well in terms of precision, timing. If you're thinking about multi-dimensional, multi-domain operations, the pace at which conflict is going to play out in the future, the more precise you can be with your timing. It becomes imperative if you want to have success in information superiority over your adversary. So there are defense, like many things in space, there are both civil and defense applications.
And how do you see, you've worked on this side, before you joined Airbus, what do you see as in the race between the civil and commercial and the security aspect? It's what's happening on quantum in the security space, literally space at the moment?
I think the point I would say actually is that it is very difficult to draw a line between the civil and military applications of space. And I think what's quite interesting about the way that we have thought, used to work in government, the way that we have thought in the past about space within government has tended to be in stovepipes of sort of civil applications and military applications. And I think it is now well understood in government and outside government that that's quite an artificial divide. Yeah. And we could actually get much more bang for our buck as a nation if we took a more systems approach to thinking about space and where we want to invest in technologies. You say Earth observation, I say ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. So these are very similar technologies with just different applications.
Yeah.
And I would say, because of most of my experience has been internationally, I've seen in other areas around the world that defence and civil side has been merged much, much earlier. It's part of the kind of DNA of a country. It's hard to sort of reverse engineer. Sometimes it's the emerging countries that are getting this right because they can learn from, not the mistakes, it's an evolution, isn't it? And the dual use aspect of space is something that's been going on a long time in other places, but not necessarily always recognised, well, deliberately not recognised. So I think definitely it also helps to stretch the pounds. You know, we all have to do a lot more and we get more capability if we can combine the dual use aspect and perhaps even looking forward to our relationship as a country with the European Space Agency. 83% of our budget, I think last year from the civil budget went to ESA. We're not involved in the security packages of ESA currently, but perhaps going forward that might change and we can get more benefit maybe from that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest changes overall in science and technology policy in the past 15 years since I started really getting involved has been the arrival of the security defense angle on so many different technologies now. And looking back, we were probably in Britain a bit naive about the idea we could keep them apart. And while we agonized about whether or not we could have something called an industrial strategy, of course, in the US, they have a security strategy, which is uncontroversial and widely accepted. And the security strategy involves being a world leader in all key technologies. So they keep on intervening and supporting and investing through federal agencies, but they don't call it an industrial strategy, they call it a security strategy and end up in the same place. So we are learning from what the US have been doing for decades. Of course, partnership between the US and the UK is now growing. And again, I'm going to see if Jay wants to comment on this, but over the summer, the AUKUS framework, bringing together Australia, UK, and the US, which was originally entirely for, or began with submarines, it's become a much wider technology collaboration. And indeed, some of the ITAR rules, which used to restrict collaboration between us and the US, sometimes to the frustration of both UK and US agencies, they all seem to be disappearing fast within the AUKUS framework, including in quantum. You just want to bring us up to date, Jay, on where you see that now.
Well, so the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is responsible for the non-weapons-based, so ITAR is International Traffic in Arms Regulation. That is the multilateral agreement between many nations that restricts arm trafficking only to like-minded countries who are not going to use them use them badly, I guess is the simplest way to put that. But the Department of Commerce controls what we in the U.S. separate arms control regulations for export from commercial technologies for export that are also have export controls attached to them. To get to the point, sorry, they just recently released a draft rule highlighting new restrictions on export control of quantum technologies to countries outside the US, but they have exempted those restrictions from needing to be put in place explicitly for the UK and Australia. And importantly, one aspect of that is what's called the deemed export rule. A deemed export is, what is meant by a deemed export is if I'm in a country and I give a lecture on some technology, I have been deemed to have exported that technology, even though I've not transferred any good. By transferring the intellectual property associated with that good, you can be, according to US law, you have committed an export of that technology. So those deemed export walls have been knocked down between the US, the UK, and Australia, which I think is a very powerful force to allow cooperation between the companies or countries.
Jay, I was interested to ask you, what do you think about the fact that AUKUS Pillar 2 doesn't have space in it at the moment? How do you see that going?
I'm actually woefully ignorant of that, I will say. The people I know in the Commerce Department who are working on that aspect have been working hard to get to agreements with Australia, but they have been rebuffed, to my understanding.
It'd be nice to pull it all together, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, I think also it's kind of dynamic, right? So I think Pillar 2 is really focused, or is initially designed to be focused on the technologies, including quantum and AI. And so where they're applied, and to your opening points about space being an important place to develop those technologies, I don't see it as being off the table. In fact, I see all sorts of opportunity in a space AUKUS.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? That space touches everything. It's its tentacles are wide and far, and bringing the technologies in, it's almost, we can't take space out of the equation. It's surely got to be there.
There is a tricky issue here which we wrestle with in the Space Agency, which is, of course, as Julie said, the civil commercial side of space. For that, most of the funding comes via our membership of the European Space Agency. On the military security side, our work is above all with the US, though increasingly in this AUKUS framework. So it's when we say military and commercial are converging, we then face the kind of policy issue of how a lot of civil work that we do in collaboration with countries in ESA that aren't necessarily close security partners of the US is tied together with security applications for which the US and Australia are the key partners. But our smart people working in the Space Agency will solve that problem.
And, we actually, Lord Willis, we actually have similar challenges in the US in that the civil uses of space, the government intervention there comes through NASA and its space programs, whereas the Pentagon has its own space budget and does not always coordinate with those people at NASA, although the US government has set up what they call the National Quantum Initiative Coordination Office, and they have developed these cross-government coordination activities on specific aspects of quantum technology, including quantum networking, quantum computing, and quantum sensing. Each of those has a separate working group trying to ensure that all these various agencies are kept abreast of what is going on, and if not working to common goal, at least not working to step on each other's toes.
Yeah, and we're indeed working on a policy document on quantum and space in the UK Space Agency and government at the moment. I think we should just pause in case there are people here who wish to put any questions to our panel. If there's any, and I think if there were any questions on Slido, we would see them here. Anybody want to intervene with any observations or questions? Right, at the far end, the maximum possible jogging distance for the microphone. Yep.
Hi, I'm Stuart Nichol from investment firm Quantum Exponential. Space has done fairly well in getting early stage venture in the UK into it. They would all say not enough. Quantum less so. We're in Mansion House. The Mansion House Accord of getting large pension funds to invest more into early stage finance is supposed to be happening. My research, I did some for the government, was they're so far away from looking at deep tech right now as a possible investment, partly from the reasons the lady mentioned earlier. What can we do to get more funding into all of these? And I would say particularly into, in my mind, the offensive part of defense, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it is still early days for implementing Mansion House. All I can say is that we in the Space Agency are having very good conversations with the British Business Bank, who did, of course, play an important role in the creation of Seraphim, the only specifically space-oriented VC investor we've got in the UK. And we would dearly like to see, as a result of the Mansion House Accord and possible future initiatives from the new Labour government, easier for us to put together some combination of the Space Agency, the British Business Bank's patient capital, and commercial investors. And we're willing to pay our part in the Space Agency, including on things like technology appraisal, de-risking, doing some of the due diligence. We've got quite a close understanding of hundreds of those British startups and small companies. And if the right framework can be set, we'd love to share that with commercial investors in some framework or other to give investors the confidence to invest. But as well as VC investment, there is also corporate venturing, and there's also the role of primes such as Airbus, who themselves can promote a big, diverse sector. So why don't you add to that from your angle, Kata?
Yeah. So the sorts of issues you're talking about is a theme of work that I was working on when I was in government. In fact, we had some discussions when I was in Whitehall doing this sort of work. And I think it's really important. What I'm struck by moving to Airbus as a sort of UK's major space prime is how closely aligned our incentives are with governments in terms of generating an innovative ecosystem in the UK. Of course, we're a European multinational with home nations in Europe as well, but certainly thinking about each of our home nations and thinking about the UK, which is my role, we're really focused on how you build up sovereign capability in the UK. Now, in terms of incentives, what do we want to do as a prime? We want to serve our armed forces and our government customers with the most cutting-edge capability there is. And we're not arrogant about the idea that we could do that all ourselves in-house. So we're very, very motivated to generate an ecosystem outside our own walls. So much so that we, about a year ago, launched our Community for Space Prosperity initiative, where we convene across SMEs and academia, other primes, to talk about how we can push the sector forward. Just a few months ago, we launched our first space accelerator. And again, not with a view, not a sort of acquisitive view particularly, but with a view to bringing our space heritage and our understanding of space and sharing that with tech companies who can draw from that experience to enhance their products and sort of catalyze them and move them forward. So I do think that the role of primes is not that well understood or not that well sort of defended, but I do think our incentives are very closely aligned. There's an awful lot happening to try and cultivate that ecosystem and stimulate that growth, because it's not a zero-sum game. You know, one grows, we all grow.
Great. No, thank you, Kata. And that's such an important point. You do notice when you are trying to promote technologies in the UK, you do notice the difference between sectors where there are some key primes with a key role and location in the UK, and those sectors feel completely different than the ones where you haven't got a prime. And sometimes we have sectors where the problem is an enormous amount of creativity for new ideas, and just you haven't got in the UK a single large corporate that would even understand what your innovators are up to. But space is different with Airbus and Thales Alenia Space and BAE Systems moving back in again. I think there's another question there.
Chris Daniels, I'm nothing to do with this gentleman, but I wanted to follow up with the question. So I work in startups and scale-ups and in academia, generally in sort of defense and deep tech technologies. And interesting, you talk about corporate venturing. One of my companies was part of Boeing's Aerospace Accelerator program, which was brilliant and really supportive. The challenge from a scale-up perspective isn't early stage investment. That is brilliant in the UK. The lower TRL is exceptional. The challenge is the stop-start nature of government contracts and the annualization of budgets. So if you're relying on government contracts, whether that flows through a prime or whether it's direct, which is the space sector, a lot of aerospace and all of defense, you cannot sensibly or easily grow a business because you do not have a natural process to go from smaller contracts to bigger contracts to developing stuff for the front line. And there's almost the government sort of spoils you by having lots of innovation contracts, but then that not leading to big chunky contracts. I just wonder what the panel's view of how to solve that, because the solution isn't more equity investment, because without having the end customer, you can't do anything with that.
Well, look, exactly. Julie, it's a difficult question, so I'm very happy to hand it over to you.
No, I'm not going to answer it. I was just going to add on whether you would agree that also, make it harder, exactly that. Another added issue is, especially when you're trying to breach the defence and civil sectors, if you're trying to bring them together, the two different budgetary cycles and their horizon, so if you're looking at 3 versus 10, or sometimes 1 versus, that is an added, so I'm sorry, Lord Willetts, I've just made the question harder.
So first of all, it is an issue. I'm not going to deny it's an issue.
And frankly, it's not an issue that's unique to the UK. It's an issue that has plagued the US as well. Those companies that are successful in going from startup to scale often are able to do that despite the forces that act against them, not because they're the beneficiary of forces that are acting to propel them along.
Yeah, and I would say, look, there is a procurement issue. Although defence brings its own uncertainties and procurement shifting to the right all the time, at least in principle on the defence side, you can procure something before it exists and before the service has been delivered. One of the constraints we face on the civil side is that Treasury rules about how you can spend procurement budgets are much more restrictive. And the starting point is you pay after the service has been delivered. It's very hard to pay in advance on the civil side, though the procurement legislation just passed at the fag end of the previous government may help a bit on that. And this government, of course, is talking about some 10-year programs in civil R&D. We have yet to see those take shape, but that could potentially help quite significantly with the problem you identified.
Just to build on that, I again recognise what you describe and the sort of need to move out of the R&D space into the kind of capability in orbit challenge. And I think that's recognised in government as well. But one of the things that helps you navigate that is figuring out how having a clear-headed idea of what you want in terms of your sovereign capabilities. I don't think anyone is, the political rhetoric is sort of all clear that no one is expecting the UK to be leading in every field in space. Yet we haven't quite got to the point where we've really crystallised the areas where we want to be exceptional. And it's not for lack of opportunity. There's all sorts of areas. Airbus is a global leader in military satellite communication, for example. But there's many other sort of space applications as well. And so I think a clearer signal from government about the areas where we want to grow sovereign capabilities would really help some of that problem.
And just quickly add to that, I think sometimes the companies get a little bit mesmerised with which they see. They think defence having these huge budgets, and then the civil side being very agile. Defence thinks the civil side can be agile, where they may not. I don't think it's quite like that on either side. It's, in my experience, both defence and civil, we're seeing the spending reviews going on currently, are all both challenged by the bottom line and making that pound stretch further. And I think joining the two sides together from the budgetary cycles will be challenging, but something that can't be ignored, because both sectors are struggling, and it's not going to be an easy ride, whatever way we go.
And we certainly, and again, one of our challenges in the Space Agency is the more we can communicate across Whitehall with departments that may not recognise how much they already use space and how much more they could. So much of the monitoring of climate change is done via space-based systems. So much of the monitoring of the consequences, flooding, weather forecasting. One of the battles that I've long been fighting, including way back when I was the minister, was we've got excellent weather forecasting. We're quite bad at forecasting flooding because we're not very good at measuring how sodden the ground is. So it's finding it much harder to convert a rainfall forecast into a flood forecast. We could use satellites to assess much more accurately exactly how wet the ground is, which would enable us in turn to model future flooding much better using AI and machine learning as well. There's a lot of DEFRA monitoring of agricultural performance. a lot of enforcement of international agreements on illegal trawling and things like that. You use satellites. So DFID, as was part of the FCO, can really find that they can help developing countries by providing that kind of information. Space is very useful, and it has got a lot of services that across the private sector and across the public sector are very valuable. Now, we've actually got some Slido questions come in, and the one that's been upvoted is a really good, meaty technology question, and we're going to move across the panel on this one. What advantages or obstacles might we see as using space in long-range quantum communication? This question is worried about issues such as microgravity and radiation. Jay, do you wrestle with those type of issues?
Exactly. These are the things that we're thinking about in the development of our satellite mission. The best way to think about this is there are things that we understand are going to affect us, and there are things we don't necessarily know how to do yet. And those are completely different kinds of risks in terms of saying, I want to build a global long-range quantum communication network. In order to start illuminating or even settling on ways to solve the things you don't know how to do, you have to figure out what the limits are to the things that you do know how to do. And so that's the step we're taking, is looking at how radiation damages or affects the performance of components that perform some of the actions that are needed to run a quantum communication network. How are those components, how do they work together? What kind of timing precision do they need? How is that affected by the amazingly harsh thermal environment that a satellite is, where over the course of an orbit, the temperature of a payload could fluctuate by 30, 40, 50 degrees, and many of these systems that do things for quantum communication, because they're working with single photons, are incredibly sensitive to things like expansion and contraction, which is what happens when you heat things up. And if you do that temporally, you have to understand how well you can accommodate those changes, how well you can control the systems to make that work. So the answer is, there are many challenges that we understand and know that we have to address. I think the more interesting question becomes, once we understand what those are, how do we solve the problems that we haven't yet figured out how to solve? Which really are, how do we synchronize and coordinate activities over global scales to the incredibly precise time synchronization needed to share this quantum information in a way that's relevant for the quantum systems? These are challenges that are both research and technology and engineering challenges that are why this field is so exciting, and why we really have to go through space in a way to answer these questions. We need space as a means to help us answer these research questions every bit as much as it is part of the obstacles to preventing us from doing it.
Katerina?
I'm not sure I've got a great deal to add on that, apart from, I suppose the theme I would pull out would be collaboration again. So, you're not going to be able to do this one organization, one nation on its own. It's about how you sort of set I like the way you put it, the sort of how you set the exam question, which then brings people behind it to try and solve it. And that requires academia, small companies, big companies, and international collaboration. We talked about AUKUS before, but through Europe as well.
Julie?
Yeah, I think, for me, I've been in the space industry over 30 years. Started my journey with the European Space Agency. My first mission was working with the shuttle, NASA retrieving a spacecraft by the robotic arm and bringing it back down. Amazing start. And during that 30 years, I think it's really important. We've seen so many developments and so much growth. I think with so many new commercial entrants into the space world, let's say the space sector, sometimes there's an assumption that we're working on technology and everything's solved and we're there already. We're not. We're still on a journey with quantum. We're still on a journey. Not everything's been solved. There's still a lot of questions to be answered. So I think we mustn't take it for granted that, we hear a lot about these words are bandied around, but maybe they're not always fully understood. And there's many, many steps to go until we get to the end product?
It's a great question, and there's a downside and an upside. The Galileo European GPS equivalent, created incidentally after an exchange in Brussels when a European representative asked the visiting American general responsible for GPS, do you guarantee that in all circumstances Europe will always be able to use GPS? To which the general said, no comment. Hence Galileo. Galileo's biggest single operational problem was that some of the atomic clocks were not functioning, and they were not functioning because they had not got the radiation hardening quite right. They were being hit and disabled. So this does matter. The question referred to microgravity, and here I'm going to make a pitch because microgravity is an opportunity for the growing of crystals, the creation of cells without needing to provide the scaffolding to protect their shape from the forces of gravity. And in one of the missions, which was sadly lost when the Virgin horizontal launch went so wrong, was a UK startup that was trying to grow the crystals that could go into compound semiconductors more rapidly and to a higher standard in microgravity in space. So there is a group of experts who would say the future of some of the key parts of compound semiconductors could well lie in production in microgravity. Is there any final question here? Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. Fascinating to hear all this. It's really interesting to have Airbus and Boeing alongside each other. Jay brought up a really interesting point about deemed export, and I'm interested in antitrust. As far as I'm an investor, so I'd like to know how that affects all of this between big commercial organizations like yourselves.
This is, of course, a CMA-compliant conference. And the fact that we have Boeing and Airbus sitting beside each other is wonderful and refreshing, and in any way improper. So this is actually an opportunity. I think this could be our final observation. It's an opportunity also for to hear from Boeing and from Airbus just a little bit more about what your company's space strategies look like, particularly how these cutting-edge technologies tie into your space strategy. So Boeing, Jay, do you want to set the ball rolling first?
What I think you're observing is the fact that the forces that drive our companies, the customers, the kinds of customers that we have, both in the commercial and defense sectors, despite us being centered around different parts of the world, those forces drive us to think about creating similar capabilities, which lead us to asking similar research and development programs, which lead us to similar strategies. They're not identical, they're similar. There are distinct differences, for instance, with how the Boeing quantum strategy is playing out versus how Airbus has put a strategy out for what they want to look at in the quantum space. I can't speak as much about the space, that's not my remit. My remit is the quantum area. And yes, if you squint and look at it from 50 yards away, you'd say those two companies are really interested in the exact same things. But when you look up close at the details, you see, no, they're not really the same. They're similar, and there are lots of points of overlap. But if you think about it, it's all driven by those customers one step back from us who drive us to think about similar motivations and capabilities.
Thank you. Kata?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. To my earlier point on sovereign capabilities, there is also that sort of dimension to think about as well. There is so much opportunity in space that there's plenty to explore, if you like. But as you say, the drivers are very much coming from the same place in the UK as they are in elsewhere in the world. And so it's inevitable there'll be some overlap. But I do think, to David's earlier point, it is a sector which is very collaborative, actually, and both across the primes, across the smaller businesses, and with academia as well. Perhaps it's to do with its size, I don't know, but it does feel like a very sort of collaborative sector, and I think that's to be embraced.
Thank you very much. Now, you created Space Foresight, so Give us your final assessment of these trends and how the big companies are placed to exploit and promote them.
Well, that's a lovely one to finish on. I think the primes do an amazing job, and they also bring along, as well as they can, the smaller companies. But we have an amazing SME culture in this country, which we don't want to lose. And we should always support them as much as we possibly can. And obviously, smaller companies are sometimes nervous of harnessing in with the big primes. And that's where we can look at the emerging nations and partnering with all that they offer. I think it's a question that I could talk a much longer on, and I think we've only got about 30 seconds, so maybe over coffee is something we can delve into.
Well, thank you very much indeed to our panelists. Thank you for your questions, both online and here in the audience. And thank you to the organisers of the City Quantum and AI Summit for letting space crash your summit and give us a slot here. Thank you very much indeed.